You are standing at a fuel pump in Mumbai. It is early morning, and the queue is already longer than the street. The station is open. The attendants are present. The digital price board is lit, but the nozzle clicks dry after a few seconds. Somewhere offshore, millions of barrels of crude oil are still floating on fully loaded tankers. Nothing has been destroyed. The ships exist. The oil exists. The port still exists, but the fuel does not arrive. Someone in that line will miss a hospital appointment because fuel became paperwork. Most people imagine global trade stops when warships close a strait or missiles hit a terminal. They picture dramatic blockades, visible violence, and headlines that announce the moment the world changed. It feels intuitive. If shipping stops, surely something physical must be broken. But that is usually not how the system fails. The first fracture is often silent. No explosion, no formal closure, no government declaration. Just a meeting in London, Zurich, Singapore, and underwriting committee, reviewing risk tables and deciding that passage through one narrow stretch of water is no longer commercially acceptable. At first glance, maritime trade looks like steel and geography. Tankers, ports, cranes, canals, physical things. Heavy things. But when you trace the system carefully, you find that physical movement is only the visible layer. Beneath it sits another layer, quieter and more powerful. Permission. The public believes navies keep trade routes open. In reality, the route can remain open while the commercial system begins withdrawing from it. The water is still there. The maps have not changed. No one has officially locked the gate. Yet the decision has already started moving through the hidden architecture of global trade. That is what makes this kind of failure so difficult to recognize. It does not arrive as a single event. It arrives as hesitation. One vessel waits, another delays departure. A cargo owner pauses. A route that was normal yesterday becomes questionable today. The visible system survives, but confidence has begun to separate from it. This is the contradiction at the center of modern trade. The world can have enough oil, enough ships, enough ports, and enough demand, yet still lose access. Not because the goods vanished, but because the invisible conditions that allowed them to move have changed. The public sees the last symptom: empty pumps, delayed deliveries, higher prices. Officials call it disruption. Companies call it volatility. Analysts call it risk. But under closer inspection, the first failure happened before the public saw anything at all. Ships do not move simply because oceans are open. They move because the system beneath them still says yes, and that word is more fragile than it appears. This is where the story changes. The visible system still exists, but the permission underneath it is failing. Without that invisible layer, the ship becomes commercially untouchable. Most people never see maritime insurance because, when it works, it is designed to be invisible. A tanker leaves port, crosses a contested sea lane, arrives, unloads, and disappears back into the ordinary rhythm of global trade. Nothing about that movement feels fragile. But every mile of that journey depends on paperwork most people will never read. A commercial vessel does not move on fuel alone. It moves on underwriting. Before cargo is loaded, before financing is finalized, before a port accepts arrival, there must be proof that catastrophe has somewhere to go. If a tanker collides, leaks crude into a harbor, damages a terminal, blocks a shipping channel, or triggers environmental claims across multiple jurisdictions, the losses can exceed the value of the ship itself. No port wants uninsured liability entering its waters. No cargo owner wants uninsured cargo crossing a war risk zone. No lender wants to finance a voyage that can turn into an uncontained legal disaster. This is why maritime insurance is not one policy. It is a layered permission system. There is hull insurance for the vessel itself, cargo insurance for what is being transported, protection and indemnity coverage, usually through P&I clubs, for the enormous third-party liabilities that follow accidents. This is the catastrophic layer. Protection against damages so large they can exceed the ship's value and make ports and counterparties refuse engagement. And in unstable regions, separate war risk coverage that can be repriced almost overnight. That final layer is where the system becomes unstable. War risk insurance is not based on whether missiles have already struck your ship. It is based on whether underwriters believe the probability of loss has changed enough to make normal pricing impossible. Sometimes the premium rises. Sometimes the deductible becomes punitive. Sometimes coverage is withdrawn entirely. That decision can happen before the first shot is fired. Underwriting is where geopolitics becomes economics. A narrow waterway like the Strait of Hormuz is not just geography. It is an actuarial problem. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that corridor. If tensions rise there, insurers do not wait for certainty. They price uncertainty itself. A transit that was routine on Monday can become commercially irrational by Thursday. And once that happens, the mathematics spreads outward. When coverage becomes uncertain, the voyage itself starts losing value. Ship owners hesitate to sail. Charterers renegotiate. Cargo owners delay loading. Lenders are no longer financing simple movement. They are measuring liability exposure they cannot control if the voyage goes wrong. Ports demand stricter compliance. Contracts begin adjusting before the public sees anything because the commercial system moves faster than headlines. Everyone understands the same truth. The loss is not the ship. The loss is being the one left holding the liability. This is why supply chain paralysis often looks irrational from the outside. People ask, if the oil exists, why not just move it? If the route is technically open, why are ships waiting offshore? Because trade is not governed by physical possibility alone. It is governed by legal acceptability. A vessel may be seaworthy, the cargo profitable, and the route physically open, yet the voyage can still become commercially unusable. Counterparties step back. Entry becomes uncertain. The economics collapse before the journey begins. This is the hidden switch that stops global trade. Not blockade, not scarcity, not even war at first. Insurance repricing. When underwriting committees decide a route can no longer be safely priced, they do not need to close the sea lane. The market closes it for them. The public usually sees the crisis at the end of the chain. They see the empty shelf, the delayed shipment, the fuel queue, the sudden price jump. It feels like the shortage began there at the moment of inconvenience. But by then, the real decision is already old. First, geopolitical tension rises, missile strikes near a shipping lane, drone attacks near a refinery corridor, naval exercises in a disputed passage, or simply the belief that disruption is now more likely. That is enough. Insurers do not wait for certainty, they reprice uncertainty. Premiums rise, coverage tightens, voyages that looked routine become balance sheet hazards. At that moment, the ship is still in port. But the freeze has begun. A charterer pauses loading because the margin no longer works. A cargo owner delays shipment because insurance costs destroy the economics of delivery. A buyer searches for alternative supply rather than risk being stranded in transit. Everyone moves defensively, and every defensive move makes the next participant more cautious. This is how paralysis spreads without a blockade. One ship waiting offshore becomes 3. 3 become 20. Ports remain technically open, but schedules begin to fracture. Refiners start counting days of supply. Manufacturers begin deciding which production lines can slow first. The public still hears the word temporary. Most shortages begin as accounting decisions before they become family emergencies. A local pharmacy does not study maritime underwriting. It simply receives an email from its distributor, generic antibiotics delayed, allocations reduced, uncertain arrival date. The pharmacist begins with apologies. Then substitutions. Then rationing. Parents arrive with prescriptions and hear the same sentence over and over. Not today, maybe next week. Nothing about that moment looks like maritime insurance. But the real failure happened weeks earlier, inside contracts and coverage decisions no patient will ever see. What reaches the counter is not just delay. It is repeated return visits, half-filled prescriptions, and the quiet humiliation of being told to come back again. In Northern Europe, a mid-sized factory producing industrial equipment faces a quieter version of the same problem. A shipment of specialized components, small, cheap individually, but essential to final assembly now costs 3 times more to move than it did 6 weeks earlier. The owner does not shut the factory. He cuts Fridays first. Then, overtime disappears. Then temporary workers are told not to return next month. Machines sit idle not because demand collapsed, but because one missing component turned the entire production line into expensive stillness. The workers call it a slowdown. The accountant calls it exposure. At home, the same mechanism arrives in smaller humiliations. A family expecting a winter heating oil delivery is told the next available truck is delayed again. The supplier can offer only a partial fill at a higher price. Now the question is no longer cost alone. Do they pay for the fuel delivery, postpone the furnace repair, or delay another bill and hope the weather stays mild? Scarcity arrives, like paperwork, not dramatic collapse. Administrative suffocation. The most dangerous shortages are rarely caused by absolute absence. They are caused by interrupted flow. Pharmacies assume replenishment. Factories assume continuity. Families assume next week will look like this week. When that assumption breaks, the people who pay first are almost never the ones who made the decision. They are the ones standing at the counter waiting for something that technically still exists. History is useful here because it removes the illusion that this is a modern anomaly. The mechanism is old. Only the speed has changed. Every crisis gets described as a surprise. It rarely is. Markets usually whisper long before governments make speeches. History is often just the record of warnings people preferred to ignore. People imagine maritime paralysis as a rare event caused by extraordinary war. But the forensic record shows something quieter. Trade routes often remain physically open while their economics become impossible. Ships can still sail. Cargo can still exist. What disappears is commercial permission. One of the clearest examples came during the 1980s tanker war, the maritime phase of the Iran-Iraq conflict. Neither side needed to fully close the Persian Gulf to create paralysis. Attacks on oil tankers, merchant vessels, and port facilities changed the insurance mathematics long before total closure was possible. The Strait of Hormuz did not formally shut. Oil still moved, but every voyage through the region became a pricing event. War risk premiums surged. A route did not have to become impossible to become uneconomic. Once the added cost changed the margin on a voyage, operators paused, renegotiated, or demanded guarantees before they would expose a vessel again. Some operators accepted the cost. Many delayed. Others demanded state guarantees or naval escorts simply to justify normal commerce. Importers absorbed the higher price because the alternative was worse. No fuel, no continuity, no political calm. This is the part history remembers poorly. People remember missiles. They forget invoices. For importing nations, especially those with little domestic energy production, the crisis did not begin when ships were hit. It began when the economics of receiving those ships changed. Governments faced rationing pressure before the public understood why. Refiners paid more. Utilities paid more. Agriculture paid more. Eventually, households paid more. The first payer is rarely the final payer. The cost travels. The same pattern appeared during the 1956 Suez Crisis. When the canal was disrupted, the problem was not simply that ships needed a longer route around the Cape of Good Hope. Distance mattered, but distance was only the visible part. Longer voyages tied up tankers for more days, reduced available capacity, tightened scheduling, and handed leverage to whoever controlled movable ships outside the immediate danger zone. The winners were not necessarily the owners of oil. They were often the owners of transport. Independent tanker operators and logistics firms could charge extraordinary spot market rates because access, not ownership, had become scarce. Commodity holders discovered an old truth. Owning supply is not the same as controlling delivery. That distinction still governs maritime crises. A nation can report strategic reserves and still face public panic. A company can show inventory on paper and still halt production. A government can insist there is no shortage while citizens queue for fuel. Inventory without transport is accounting, not security. This is also why who pays first is often misunderstood. It is not always the poorest first. It is the most import-dependent first. Island economies, manufacturing states relying on imported components, agricultural systems dependent on foreign fertilizer, energy markets built on continuous tanker arrivals. These feel the pressure earliest because they have the least room to reroute reality. The pain then moves downward. Hospitals ration procurement. Factories shorten shifts. Transport costs move into food prices. Keating becomes political. Small businesses fail not because demand vanished, but because continuity became too expensive to maintain. And who benefits? Usually the actors furthest from public attention. Shipping intermediaries with optionality. Operators with access to safer jurisdictions. Owners of independent fleets, firms controlling end-to-end logistics rather than single vulnerable links. They can wait, reroute, demand premiums, or sell scarce movement capacity into panic. This is not moral, it is structural. Systems under stress reward control over movement more than ownership of goods. That is the historical lesson most people miss. In both crises, the scarce asset was not only oil, cargo, or inventory. It was controlled movement. The losers owned goods they could not move. The winners controlled movement. Others had to buy. They are the ones who still control the route. What looks safest in normal times is often the most fragile under stress. Stability has a dangerous habit. It teaches people to mistake smooth function for permanent safety. Modern supply chains are built to reward efficiency, not resilience. Just in time sounds intelligent because during stability, excess inventory looks like waste. Warehouses appear inefficient. Redundancy looks expensive. Local production seems irrational compared to cheaper imports moving smoothly across oceans. Until movement stops. A company can report strong margins while carrying only days of critical inventory. A hospital can function with perfect procurement metrics and still have no real buffer against transport disruption. A nation can celebrate low storage costs while depending entirely on uninterrupted maritime confidence. This is not strength, it is borrowed stability. The most fragile asset in a crisis is often continuity you do not control. A commodity sitting safely on paper is not the same as fuel arriving at a refinery. A medicine listed in procurement software is not the same as antibiotics on a pharmacy shelf. What appears secure in accounting can fail completely in movement. History shows the same survivors repeatedly. Localized production networks, firms that control end-to-end logistics, businesses with inventory buffers large enough to absorb delay instead of merely reporting efficiency. Jurisdictions with transport optionality rather than single route dependence. They survive because they own continuity, not because they predict the future better. This is why the useful question is rarely, will there be a shortage? The better question is, who still has choices when normal systems stop behaving normally? That answer reveals far more than price charts. At the household level, the same logic applies, though on a smaller scale. Imported essentials with no local substitute, medicines with fragile replenishment cycles, heating dependency tied to unstable transport routes. These are not abstract macroeconomic issues. They are ordinary vulnerabilities disguised as convenience. The issue is rarely panic. It is timing. Historically, systems punish the person who must transact immediately. They reward the person who can wait. The difference is optionality, the ability to avoid becoming the forced buyer in a rationed market, the worker accepting worse terms because delay is impossible, the business making expensive decisions because continuity ran out before choices did. The same pattern appears across institutions. Under stress, systems reward control of transport, storage, and continuity more than perfect efficiency. The market eventually rediscovers what it ignored during calm periods. Resilience is not inefficient. It was simply underpriced. Trade routes are often described as infrastructure. They are not. They are trust systems. Steel matters. Geography matters. Navies matter. But beneath all of it sits an unwritten agreement that risk can still be priced, losses can still be absorbed, and ordinary commerce can still be trusted. When that agreement fails, the ships do not sink first. They wait, and that is the warning. The visible world still looks functional right up until movement quietly stops. Ports remain open, inventories still appear on balance sheets. Officials still use the word temporary, but the math has already changed. And when the math fails, the ships drop anchor. The real divide is not rich versus poor, or even prepared versus unprepared. It is dependence versus awareness. One waits for the system to resume. The other asks what survives when it does not. Most people only recognize the system after it stops protecting them. We examine the ledgers of history so you can recognize the pattern before it reaches your street. Subscribe to understand the invisible math that runs the world.